Hello, world, and welcome to the In My Footsteps podcast. I am Christopher Sutherland, coming to you from the vacation destination known as Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and this is episode 87. Fall has begun, but we're not quite ready to get rid of summer yet, so this week's episode is going to celebrate both. We're going to begin with the unique story of Cape Cod's Three Sisters of Nauset Lighthouses. Our road trip is going to look at the best scenic fall foliage drives in each of the 6 New England states. We're going to go way back in the day and look at what it was like as a child of the 80s getting a crash course on television of the 1950s and 60s through Nick at Night. There's going to be a brand new top 5 that are the top 5 defunct New England amusement parks. And of course, we'll have a brand new This Week in History and time capsule, all coming up right now on episode 87 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Welcome in. How's everybody doing out there? We're into fall, just leaving summer behind. That's why I've got fall foliage and amusement parks all mixed together this week. It's my favorite time of year. Basically starts off right after Labor Day ends, goes all the way through to New Year's. So this is all in my wheelhouse. And then starting next week, it's October, so spooky season. I've got some good scary / true crime stories that'll be getting featured. I first wanted to start off by just saying thank you to everyone who tunes in. I love putting these together and sharing them and just seeing the response that each episode gets. Like I say, I try to find things that you will find interesting. With this podcast being kind of like a quilt with a bunch of segments stitched together, I hope at least one of them you find interesting each week. I wanted to give a shout out to Christopher for giving me a donation on Buy Me a Coffee. I really appreciate it. I always say if you donate, that's great. If you can't, if you share the podcast, that means just as much to me. Christopher also made a suggestion. He had said he was having trouble finding the podcast through searches when looking for Cape Cod podcasts. So I don't know if you noticed this week or last week that the podcast name is slightly changed, where it is now In My Footsteps, a Cape Cod and New England podcast. Because why not put the area where this is mainly about? When I first did this podcast way back in November of 2020, I had thought a shorter name was better, easier for people to find. But now, almost 2 years in, I realized maybe I should put in the title what the podcast is about. And I can't really put New England and Cape Cod history, travel, nostalgia, lifestyle. It's way too long. So this was the compromise. So just let me know if you have an easier time finding the podcast or if it makes no difference whatsoever and I just changed it for the sake of change. In another bit of super exciting breaking news, I reopened my TikTok page. It's just Christopher Sutherland, just my name. I hadn't done a TikTok video in about 1.5 years, but I know it's a really popular app and a really great way to promote myself and my work. So I'm giving it another go, and the fact that you can do videos up to 10 minutes long, that means that I can release a lot of podcast clips and some of my 4K New England videos and stuff like that. So be on the lookout for me on TikTok now. I won't be doing dancing videos, but there'll be a lot of entertaining content. And speaking of entertaining, we're going to kick off this episode with the unusual and entertaining story of the Three Sisters of Nauset Lighthouses. They have one of the most interesting stories of any lighthouses in New England. So let's dive right into the story of them right now on episode 87 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Lighthouses are invariably connected to the sea. They overlook the water, helping to guide vessels safely. However, there are 3 fascinating little lighthouses in Eastham that are not even within sight of the water. Sitting quietly in a field 1/3 of a mile from the ocean's waves are the Three Sisters of Nauset. How did they get there, though? Well, this is their story. The history of the Three Sisters began nearly 200 years ago when the town of Eastham petitioned to have a beacon built along the shore after there had been so many shipwrecks. The proposal was approved on March 3rd, 1837, with $10,000 being appropriated for construction of the new lighthouse. That's about $308,000 in today's money. Instead of there being one lighthouse, though, it was decided that there would be three. The reasoning was to help vessels differentiate the Eastham lights from the single Highland light to the north in Truro and the twin lights of Chatham to the south. The 15-foot-tall brick structures were constructed by local builder Winslow Lewis and his team, who had put in the lowest bid. These triplet lighthouses were hastily built by Lewis and his crew, 150 feet apart on 5 acres of land that had been bought for $150. In total, it only took 38 days for construction of the 3 lighthouses. The crew did not even abide by the markers for the 3 beacons that had been laid out. The project was seen afterward to have been cursed, as work on the beacons had occasionally occurred on Sundays, which was seen at the time as a desecration of the Sabbath. On July 30th, 1838, the Eastham lighthouses were lit for the first time. The 3 towers, which were initially referred to as the line lights, due to the fact that they were constant and not flashing, soon gained the 3 Sisters nickname. Legend has it that vessels passing by remarked that they resembled 3 ladies in white dresses wearing black hats. Iconic author Henry David Thoreau came upon them during one of his visits to Cape Cod in the mid-19th century. He was less than impressed, calling the beacons shiftless and costly. Another harsh criticism came from a report from Lieutenant Edward Carpenter when inspecting the site in 1858. He saw the 3 Sisters as serving no purpose, as they did not help guide vessels into any nearby harbor. Carpenter also stated that the job of the 3 could just as easily be done by one beacon, preferably with a red-colored lantern. Despite those less than favorable opinions by some, the lighthouses did their job for decades until shoreline erosion threatened them. Today, when a lighthouse is threatened, measures are taken to save them by moving them safely away from the eroding cliffs. In the late 1800s, though, the 3 brick towers were simply allowed to succumb to nature and fall into the sea. They were replaced in 1892 by 3 new Sisters, standing 22 feet tall and 150 feet apart. These new wooden towers with brick foundations were positioned 30 feet back from where the original towers had fallen. The relentless hand of nature continued to eat away at the cliffs of present-day Nauset Light Beach. In less than 20 years, the shoreline had eroded to the point that it was within 8 feet of one of the towers. Finally, in 1911, it was decided that a single flashing lighthouse would be the best course of action going forward, and the 3 Sisters were officially decommissioned. At that point, only the center tower would remain as a solo beacon attached to the lighthouse keeper's house. The 2 discontinued lights were sold to BJ and Helen Cummings in 1918 for $3.50 each, or $68.67 in today's money. They were moved in 1920 down nearby Cable Road after some repairs, and they were joined together by a room and renamed the Twin Lights Cottage. The beacons were used, one as a pair of bedrooms, the other as a kitchen, and the cottage also saw use as a gift shop and dance studio. The career of that remaining sister, the center tower that was along the shore, that was short-lived. By 1923, it had also fallen into disrepair, but rather than fixing it up, it was decided that it would be decommissioned and replaced. It was sold to Albert and Mary Hall for 50 cents, or about $8.66 in today's money. They bought a lighthouse for less than $10. This center beacon was turned into a cottage much like the other 2 and named the Beacon. But what of the beach with no lighthouse? Well, a perfect substitute to take command of protecting Eastham's coastal waters sat 13 miles to the south in Chatham. It was there at the Coast Guard station where another recently decommissioned lighthouse, one of the Chatham Twin Lights, resided. The 48-foot-tall cast iron lighthouse was moved to Eastham, and Nauset Lighthouse was born, although it did not get its partial coat of red paint until 1940. After the formation of the Cape Cod National Seashore in 1961, the lighthouse cottages were grandfathered in. In 1965, the Twin Lights cottage on Cable Road was purchased by the National Park Service. The Center Tower cottage was purchased 10 years later in 1975. It was at this point they decided to reunite all of the sisters. So the Center Tower was placed in its former spot between the other two for the first time in over 50 years. After extensive renovations in the 1980s, the three sisters were opened for tours with a formal dedication of the site taking place on May 16, 1990. At the turn of the 21st century, the three sisters caused a bit of a stir along the shore. It is just offshore at Nauset Light Beach that a circular brick foundation was unearthed by the shifting sands. It was determined to be a foundation of one of the three sisters that had fallen over the bluff. Since then, the foundation gets covered up by sand. It gets revealed again. So it's a fun little game to go out to Nauset Light Beach, essentially a straight shot to the water from where Nauset Lighthouse currently stands. Because when the tide is low enough and the time is right, that circular foundation of one of the original three sisters gets exposed. And to this day, the three sisters, the second set of them, they stand stoically in a green field on Cable Road. You can park at Nauset Light Beach and walk a third of a mile, 10 minutes at most, to get to them. But in the last couple of years, they actually built a parking lot right next to the lighthouses, along with a new road that leads out to cottages, as the original Nauset Light Road that passed by the lighthouse has been shut down, as it is getting way too close to the bluffs. And at some point, perhaps even in my lifetime, they're going to have to move Nauset Lighthouse back again. Lighthouses are a part of the fabric of Cape Cod and have been for centuries. Some have simple stories, some have complex stories. It's likely, though, that none of them have a story that's as unique as that of the three sisters. To go from lighthouses on the beach, to being used for cottages, to now standing in a green field, not even within sight of the water. I highly recommend you go and check them out, though. If you're on the Cape, or even if you've lived here forever, it's definitely worth checking them out. We're in the first full week of fall as this podcast goes live, and one of the most popular traditions of the fall season, especially in the north and in New England and such, is leaf peeping / fall foliage drives. You get people coming from all over to come up here to see the leaves change colors. And I thought, what better road trip to do than to share one of the most popular fall foliage drives in each state? I picked one from each state, so everybody listening in New England, in New York, you should be able to try at least one of these. I did a lot of research, bostonmagazine.com, newengland.com, and I picked ones that I think are manageable and enjoyable. So let's dive into them. In the state of Massachusetts, we have the Mohawk Trail, which winds through western Massachusetts. Mohawk Trail is basically Route 2 is the name of it. It goes 60 miles from the town of Millers Fall, Massachusetts, all the way to the New York border. I did the entirety of the drive when coming back to Cape Cod from a vacation I did out in the Berkshires a few years ago. One thing I noticed with this trail is the changing in elevation and the winding roads that, combined with the colorful changing leaves, it kind of makes you feel like you're in another world. I found myself stopping repeatedly just to get pictures of the road with the leaves, or to get a picture of the sign for Florida, Massachusetts, which I just think is funny that we have a town named Florida in the state. There's loads to see, like the Bridge of Flowers in Shelburne Falls, But if you're going to go there, I would recommend going like now if you're listening to this podcast when it drops. Because as soon as we get the first frost, the flowers on the bridge are going to start to die. As was the case when I went there. They were all dead when I showed up. Up in New Hampshire is the Kankamagus Highway. It stretches 34 miles through the White Mountains between the towns of Lincoln and Conway. So I said I had only done the Massachusetts Foliage Trail that's on this road trip segment, but I've also done the Kankamagus Highway, just not as leaf peeping. I actually went up there to run it. I ran from Kankamagus Pass, which was the highest point along the route. Did about 4 miles out, 4 miles back to kind of test my legs for a marathon I was training for. There's a lot of wide open scenery with the mountains around, but then you'll get the trees right along the route. It's very rural, very deserted. You need to make sure you have enough gas to get through the trail because there's no gas stations. There's pretty much no cell phone service, which is a good thing when you're out there trying to just enjoy nature. And you never know. You might see a moose. You might see a bear. The neat thing about the Kank and being through the White Mountains is that the changes in elevation also lead to different times that the leaves change colors. So you could go up there right now and there'll be changes in the colors, as opposed to mid-October or so if you come further south into Connecticut, Rhode Island. Up in Maine is the Acadia National Park Loop, which I visited Acadia way back in 2010. Got to watch the sunset on top of Cadillac Mountain, which was mind-blowing. It's amazing how popular Acadia is, but if you drive the loop, even in summertime, it seems like it's deserted because it's so big. The loop trail is 27 miles and basically goes all around Acadia, Bar Harbor. If you're going to go up to Acadia for fall foliage, I would recommend staying up there. Find an affordable hotel. That's what I did in Bar Harbor because there's so much to see in Acadia, way beyond just the foliage that you'll see. I mentioned Cadillac Mountain. There's the Thunder Hole, which is basically a crevice in between rocks that when the waves rush in, it sounds like thunder and the water explodes up. So take your time there. Take your time at any of these places. If you're doing the drive, take the time to enjoy it and get lots of pictures and video. Sticking up in northern New England, there's Smuggler's Notch in Vermont. Smuggler's Notch is one of the most popular drives in New England, period. And the joke is that pretty much anywhere in Vermont is considered a scenic foliage drive during the fall. But Smuggler's Notch is between Stowe and Jeffersonville. It's Route 108, and there's lots of, much like the Mohawk Trail, a lot of changes in elevation. There's some pretty steep grades, so make sure that you go on a day that's warm enough that the road might not be frosty. I don't believe there's anything quite like the hairpin turn at the Mohawk Trail where it's pretty dangerous. But you've got Mount Mansfield, which is nearly 4,400 feet, and the route goes all around it. So you could have a stop off at Mount Mansfield State Forest, have a picnic there. And of course, a lot of you know Smuggler's Notch and the town of Stowe. It's known for its skiing. So this is another place that you could go in the dead of winter if you like skiing and the winter scenery. There's really not a bad time of year to go to any of these routes. It's just in wintertime you got to be more aware of the conditions of the road because especially the northern New England ones are pretty high elevations. Sticking around in southern New England, though, you've got a little bit more wiggle room as far as when you go to see the foliage. It can be as late as mid to late October that things start to change. The Last Green Valley Scenic Byway is a great one to check out. It's a total of 35 miles in length between Woodstock and Norwich, Connecticut, and you don't have to drive all 35 miles, naturally. It's Route 169, and you can pick it up anywhere. It goes through 35 different towns. Which I laugh because they must be small towns if it's a 35-mile route and it goes through 35 towns. There may not be winding mountain peaks like in northern New England, but there's a lot of forest and farmland, which that abundance of trees leads to more of an abundance of the colorful leaves. There's historic homes, hiking trails. It's a different experience. And like I said, with all of these, I give you the full length of the trail, where it starts, where it ends for all of these driving routes. You don't have to drive the whole thing, but you're going to end up getting kind of lost in the scenery that you'll find out you're done. That was how it was with me with the Mohawk Trail. Suddenly I was done. I had driven the whole thing. And lastly, on this special road trip for the best fall foliage drives, we come to Rhode Island. It's kind of fitting because the Blackstone River Valley Drive begins in Rhode Island in Pawtucket and then goes north to Uxbridge, Massachusetts. So we come back to the state we started at. Blackstone River Valley is a beautiful place to go in the fall. I've been through there, through Uxbridge, Upton, Sutton, places like that, Grafton. It's 30 total miles in length to drive, so it's really manageable. But it's a little bit different than the other. There's mills and taverns. It's more connected with the industrial era of the country. That's part of the reason why I love New England, is that we've got 6 states, but each one's got its own identity. Where if I ask you to close your eyes and picture quintessential Rhode Island or Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, you get a different image for every state. That's why I tried to choose routes to show you the differences between each state. Have you done any of these routes before? Have you driven any of them? Maybe there's some that I'm missing. I picked one from each state, but there were a lot of others. I'll put a link up to the Boston Magazine article that's got a whole bunch of more routes if you want to try them out. But the main thing when it comes to these types of road trips, get your camera, get in your car, and just go. When the leaves start to change, any route becomes a scenic route. But it doesn't last forever. From now until early to mid-November, maybe. And also, let me know what you think of this different type of road trip. I didn't give you any places to stay or where to eat. I just gave you the roads and said just drive. That's usually what I tell you on these, is get in your car and drive and kind of let you find your own way. So here we go. Here's proof. But that'll wrap up this week's road trip. Get out there, get in the car, and do some leaf peeping. So much beauty awaits you out there in New England. This week in history, we are going back 53 years ago this week, September 26th, 1969, and the Beatles releasing their Abbey Road album. Everybody knows the Beatles. Even if you're young, you know who they are. One of, if not the most influential musical acts of all time. Abbey Road was technically their second to last album, with Let It Be coming out in 1970. But for all intents and purposes, Abbey Road was the last album, with the band coming back together to finish Let It Be, which they had started before. And the way you can kind of tell is the fact that on Abbey Road, all four of them are rarely in any songs together. It's usually 3 of the 4, because Lennon and McCartney were both battling it out to see who would quit the band first. As with all of the Beatles albums, this Abbey Road included so many legendary songs like Come Together, Something, Here Comes the Sun. It was the 11th studio album by the Beatles. And by this point, with this band, how big they were, I think it was only natural that the 4 of them wanted to see what they could do on their own. And there's that legendary cover of the album of the 4 of them crossing that crosswalk on Abbey Road, which led into the conspiracy theory that Paul McCartney had died and it was a look-alike that was in the band, with Lennon dressed in white leading the group and McCartney with no shoes like he was a corpse. Some crazy stuff, crazy conspiracy theories. Naturally, the album went to number 1 in basically every country you could imagine. The album, through all of its re-releases and remastering, it sold well over 30 million copies. And even though there were some mixed reviews, the album is regarded as a landmark album in music. And think about that. That was with the Beatles basically breaking up, that they can put something out like Abbey Road. And the Beatles would get back together later in 1969, finish up Let It Be, which was their swan song. But it's amazing to think of the influence of the Beatles still to this day. how they just couldn't put out a bad album, even when they were fighting and wanted to all quit. But 53 years ago this week, the Beatles put out Abbey Road, yet another piece of amazing history in their catalog of unbelievable music. And now it's time for a brand new time capsule. We're going to stick to the same day that Abbey Road was released, September 26th, 1969. So let's see what was going on in the world of pop culture the day that Abbey Road was released. The number one song was Nothing by the Beatles. It was Sugar Sugar by the Archies. This song is very famous. It's every bit bubblegum pop. The Archies is the cartoon group. The song is on the album Everything's Archie. It was written by Jeff Barry and Andy Kim. The song was number one in America for 4 weeks and number one in the UK for 8 weeks. The Archies version of this song sold 6 million copies, and it's been redone many times since, including by Wilson Pickett the next year, which made it a hit again. The number one movie was The Learning Tree. This was a coming-of-age drama film starring Kyle Johnson, Mira Waters, and Alex Clark about 14-year-old Newt Winger, born into a poor black family in Kansas, who learns about love and fear and life in general. It's 75% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, and it was hard to find any budget for the film or box office receipts. It made $1.5 million in rentals. I have no idea what that means, if that's in general since it's been released. But it was the first film directed by an African American for a major film studio, and in 1989 was selected for preservation by the Library of Congress for being culturally significant, so it's got to be a very impactful movie. The number one TV show was Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, sketch comedy variety show. It starred Dan Rowan and Dick Martin and ran for a total of 6 seasons and 140 episodes between 1968 and 1973. It's known for starting the career of Goldie Hawn, but also having some legendary comics on it like Ruth Buzzy, Lily Tomlin, Henry Gibson, and Gary Owens, the announcer. And if you were around back then, September 26, 1969, and you were looking for the hip new way to listen to music, you could get yourself an 8-track cartridge player from Montgomery Ward, which they described as the coming thing. I don't know what the hell that means. But you could get the stereo with 2 speakers and headphones for $119.95 or $968 in today's money. But that's just the stereo. You've got to actually buy some 8-tracks to play in your 8-track player. Don't worry, Montgomery Ward has you covered there too. They've got music by Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, Tom Jones, Aretha Franklin, and the Beatles. You could get yourself an 8-track by any of them for $6.69, or a whopping $54 in today's money. Could you imagine going to any sort of music store today and getting a CD for $54? Just a regular one? And this is an 8-track. But good luck to you if you were alive in 1969. I'm sure those 8 tracks will stand the test of time. And that's going to wrap up another time capsule, another This Week in History. We talked earlier about fall and fall foliage drives. Well, let's take one last look back at summer and a brand new top 5. These are going to be the top 5 defunct New England amusement parks coming up right now. There are a few things that scream summer and excess spending, like going to visit an amusement park during the heat of July and August. There are so many New England amusement parks still available today, but this week's top 5 is going to look at the ones that used to be. These are the best amusement parks that used to be around but are now no longer. As with all of these top 5 lists, or at least most of them, they're in no particular order. The only criteria is that these places had to be considered amusement parks and must no longer be around. So that leaves out Riverside Park, which I wanted to put in here, out in Agawam, Massachusetts. Being stupid, I forgot that it's now Six Flags, so that doesn't count. And with all of the lists, we have some honorable mentions to kind of get your memories going. Honorable mentions include Wonderland Amusement Park from Revere, Massachusetts, which I'll be talking about more in depth in a future episode. There was also Benson's Wild Animal Farm in Hudson, New Hampshire, and Crescent Park in Riverside, Rhode Island. Do you remember those? It's fine if you don't. We're going to dive right into the top 5 now, starting at number 1, Rocky Point Amusement Park. This was in Warwick, Rhode Island, and was open from the 1840s all the way up to 1995. If you grew up in the 80s or 90s in New England, you probably remember seeing Rocky Point commercials, especially if you got the Rhode Island TV stations on your TV. It was open seasonally from Memorial Day to just after Labor Day, and from the 50s until its closing, it was one of the most popular attractions in all of Rhode Island. They had concerts sometimes at the Palladium Ballroom, the Shore Dinner Hall, and of course famous rides like the Skyliner, Log Flume, and Corkscrew Loop roller coaster. Interestingly, even after closing well over 25 years ago, the grounds of the park are still open. You can go and walk. It's been mostly cleared out, but it's really neat. There's parts of former equipment still there, and it just makes it a unique experience. I'll post a couple of pictures from when I went there so you can see what I mean. Number 2 is Paragon Park. This was in the town of Hull, Massachusetts, right on Nantasket Beach. It was open from 1905 to 1984. So some of you that are somewhat older than me probably would remember this better than I do. Although the carousel is still there, which makes it a little bit of a connection to the past. They had a wooden roller coaster known as the Giant Coaster, a Ferris wheel, and they had other rides that you can still find at county fairs, Tilt-A-Whirl, those crazy swings, Super Slide. But the main attraction was that carousel, which was built in 1928 with the wooden horses. So you can kind of relive Paragon Park in Hull. But if you also want to find it in somewhere else, the Giant Coaster is still alive too. It's actually at Six Flags, nicknamed the Wild One. But this is in Six Flags in Maryland, so it's not the one in Agawam. Number 3 is Whalum Park. This was in the town of Lunenburg, Massachusetts, out in Worcester County. It was in operation from 1893 all the way up to 2000. It's now a condominium complex. The Flyer Comet wooden roller coaster was one of its most well-known rides. They also had an old carousel, but that, when the park closed, it got broken up, so you can't ride it anymore. They had other unique rides like the Looper, the Scrambler. Kids of my age will probably remember the advertisements on TV, but we living on Cape Cod weren't close enough to drive 2 hours out west to Worcester to go to it. At the time of its closing, Whalum Park was the 13th oldest amusement park in the country, as well as the second oldest trolley park. Number 4 was Lincoln Park, not the band. This amusement park was in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, and was opened from 1894 to 1987. It was hugely popular in its day, with tons of rides, bowling alley, dance hall. The end, though, came when their famous Comet roller coaster had a fatal accident in 1986, which led people to question the safety of the park. That led to a decline in attendance. The park had a lot of debt, and within a year it was closed. It remained vacant for 25 years. There were a lot of pictures you can find online of the decaying rides, but finally the Comet roller coaster got torn down in 2012. And finally, number 5 is Savin Rock Amusement Park. This was located in West Haven, Connecticut. It was open from the 1870s up to 1966, so I'm not sure how many of you listening had ever even heard of it. I only heard of it doing my research for this segment. But at its peak, it was attracting more than 1.2 million visitors per year. It was probably based on all of the roller coasters it had, which included the Thunderbolt, Sky Blazer, and White City Flyer. It was nearly destroyed by the hurricane of 1938, but it survived and kept going for another 30 years. And a lot of the artifacts you can see at the Savin Rock Museum and Learning Center in West Haven. But that's the top 5. Did you go to any of these amusement parks? Had you even heard of some of them? Rocky Point, Paragon Park, Whalum Park, Lincoln Park, and Savin Rock Amusement Park. Go on to YouTube. You can find commercials for at least 3 of those 5. And I'll be back next week with a brand new top 5 that's sure to stir up some sweet nostalgia for everyone my age, younger, older, whoever. As I've stated a million times on this podcast, I am a child of the 1980s. I've got countless thousands of memories from that time, which is why I love doing the nostalgia segments on this podcast. But one thing I found interesting was my knowledge of 1950s and early 60s TV shows, especially from back in the 80s. And that can all be traced back to the creation of maybe not a new network, but kind of a new direction in programming for Nickelodeon. So I wanted to go way, way back in the day and look at what it was like to be a kid getting exposed to these classic TV shows with the dawning of Nick at Night. Way back in episode 10, I talked about the dawning of Nickelodeon, the creation of the channel, and my first memories of watching it. Shows like Danger Mouse, Double Dare, You Can't Do That on Television, Mr. Wizard. And I only briefly touched on Nick at Night. Nick at Night is still going strong. And for those that may have never heard of what this is, it was when Nickelodeon would get to be later in the evening, 8 or 9 o'clock at night, they would switch over from the kid and teen shows and just play old classic television shows. All black and white, basically. The genesis of Nick at Night came when the Arts and Entertainment Network, which previously occupied that time on Nickelodeon, was spun off into its own network, which I never knew. Before Nick at Night, Nickelodeon would just run promos for their other shows, and they tried original content, but it just didn't work. So this is when programming and branding consultants Alan Goodman and Fred Siebert came up with the idea of an oldies TV network. It was basically the greatest hits of TV. It debuted on July 1st, 1985, so I was 7 years old. I don't know when I started watching Nick at Night. It could have been I was just a kid flipping around and saw something different. Initially, it ran 7 nights a week from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. and was typically mostly sitcoms, maybe a drama here and there, maybe a movie. For those of you that are in my generation that watch Nick at Night, take a moment and think of what's the first shows that you think of. For me, it was the Donna Reed show, Car 54, Where Are You?, My Three Sons. It was sort of a weird mix to be a kid then, watching all the typical shows from the 1980s, mid-80s. Maybe Cosby Show, Alf, maybe Knight Rider, Dukes of Hazzard I loved. But then to also have this other side where I looked forward to these old shows. For the most part, they were much simpler in the storytelling from the 50s. It's just a different time. Mr. Ed with the talking horse. I always loved that show. There was Dennis the Menace, who was a troublemaker, but a 1960s troublemaker, not like how it would get changed as the decades went by. Dennis the Menace was the very first show ever shown on Nick at Night. And there were so many classic TV shows from back then that I started to get acquainted with, like Lassie. And the channel, that lineup must have been popular because it's still around today, but they started to add different shows. It was almost like the later it got, late 80s, early 90s, they were able to start pulling shows from the mid to late 60s, F Troop, Bewitched. I'll never forget, for a brief time, they had a show on there called Lancelot Link, Secret Chimp. You want to talk about trippy psychedelic 60s show. It's literally like a chimpanzee that talks and is a secret agent. It's like people saw a talking horse on Mr. Ed and said, we'll see that and we'll give you this acid trip show. That show was on for 2 seasons and a total of 13 episodes. But yet when I think of Nick at Night, I can picture the show in my head. It's crazy. I'm sure my sister Kate, if she's listening to this, can picture it in her head too. We used to laugh at the foolishness. But as time went on, Nick at Night started to evolve. They started playing SCTV, which was basically the Canadian cousin of Saturday Night Live. The original show was on from 1976 to 1984, and it had so many famous comedians on it. John Candy, Martin Short, Eugene Levy, Rick Moranis, Catherine O'Hara. And it was great. When they would show SCTV, it wasn't that old of a show. So you could watch the show and then see John Candy in Splash or Eugene Levy in Splash 2 or American Pie and Martin Short in Three Amigos. Another one of those brief shows that I was a big fan of on Nick at Night was Mad Movies. This starred a comedy group called the LA Connection. There were only 26 episodes, but basically what it was old movies, 50s, 60s, and these comedians would do their own kind of stand-up work over it, basically making fun of the show. Go and look it up on YouTube and find their parody of Night of the Living Dead. I still remember that because I had never seen Night of the Living Dead when I was 11, 12 years old, and them making fun of the zombies, I guess, made it not as scary. But for me, the memories of Nick at Night still come back to those original old shows. And as a kid, 8, 9, 10 years old, becoming invested in shows that were, even at that time, 30 years old. Nick at Night has kind of changed over the years. There's a lot more recent shows that they've started to put on there. But their idea of a greatest hits of TV network spawned a lot of these classics that you see today, like MeTV, even music ones like VH1 Classic. Because there's a market for nostalgia. That's why I do a lot of it on the podcast. But there's a market out there for people my age, older. It's a comfort food for the soul. But did you out there watch Nick at Night back in the 80s when you were kids? I mean, not now. It's different now. They even run actual Nickelodeon shows, like repeats of their old shows at Nick at Night. But I'm talking about those old days in the 80s, where I knew all of the words to the shows they would air, at least the ones that had lyrics to their songs like Gilligan's Island or Car 54. And if you watched Nick at Night back then, what was your favorite old show that they used to share? I loved Mr. Ed. I think that was my favorite. The idea of a talking horse was very amusing to 8, 9-year-old me. But even to me back then, some of the shows were cheesy, like My Three Sons, where whatever drama they had was just level 1 on a scale of 1 to 10. But like I said, 50s, early 60s, it was a different sort of culture. Everything was wholesome. There were very, very rarely ever any problems that couldn't be solved in that half hour. Except on Lancelot Link. Boy, what an insane show that was. A talking chimp that solves crimes. It sounds like something that I would have created with my camcorder in the 90s. But if you have the time, take a few minutes, go on YouTube, find some of those classic Nick at Night shows. They have some where it's with the commercials from back then, too. That's one of my rabbit holes I go down, sometimes when edibles kick in. But it's a lot of fun. Nostalgia's fun. That's why I do it. So go enjoy some nostalgia now with Nick at Night. And that's going to wrap up episode 87 of the In My Footsteps podcast. I hope you had a fun trip down memory lane. Maybe the road trip gives you an idea to take some trips down a new memory lane. Like I always say, thank you so much to everyone that tunes in, that shares the podcast. I appreciate it as I enjoy doing these. They're sort of my own escape, and I hope that's what the podcast is for you also. A brief escape from the craziness of the world. If you want to make a donation, you can find me on Buy Me a Coffee, find the In My Footsteps podcast. Any donations go toward advertising the podcast. But like I say, that, if you can't donate, I really appreciate those that share the podcast, word of mouth. That's the best way to make this grow. Find me all over social media. Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. I just posted a new 4K New England video there. My trip to the Wayside Inn Historic District in Sudbury, Massachusetts. It's a great video. There'll be more to come. Now, like I said, I'm back on TikTok. I don't know what that's going to entail. I might share some of the podcast segments, some of the old podcast videos, retro clips from way back a year ago. But it's all free ways to promote the podcast, which is the best thing for me. Check out my homepage, ChristopherSetterland.com. Created, updated, designed by my oldest friend, Barry Menard. You've heard me mention him a ton. You've also heard me mention Kiwis Customs at Etsy.com. Kiwis, both spelled with K's. Homemade, handcrafted gifts for any occasion. Cat and dog sweaters, baklavas, fairy hats. There's jewelry. Kaylee Marks is always brainstorming new ideas also. And she takes requests if it's something that's in her wheelhouse that she does and you have a twist on it that you would like. Go to Kiwis Customs at Etsy.com. Send her a message. Look at what she's got. It costs nothing to look. We're approaching October. There's so many holidays coming up. Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas. She's going to have holiday-themed gifts, so keep your eyes peeled to Kiwis Customs at Etsy.com. And also keep your eyes peeled to Mind, Body, Spine Chiropractic and our sister gym, Cape Kettlebell. We're trying to become a one-stop shop for everything wellness. It's so much more than chiropractic. I'm not a chiropractor, obviously, and I'm there as personal trainer, corrective exercise, a lot of rehab stuff. But we got Dr. Michael Singleton, the master chiropractor, knowledgeable in nutrition, fitness, and just life in general. He's always got something that he shares with me that just opens my eyes to something I never thought of. And if he can do that for me, he can definitely do it for you. And we got one-on-one training, small group fitness. Trainer Maggie, she does a lot of that. I dabble in it. I'm heading more towards the rehab side, getting people back to 100% so that then they can go to Cape Kettlebell and just kick ass. We're doing a lot of updating of our website, so hopefully I'll have a lot more of that to share in the coming weeks and months, of course. But in the meantime, next week is episode 88, the first in the month of October. Spooky season has begun, and it's going to kick off with the story of Provincetown's secret smallpox cemetery. I don't want to give too many spoilers. You'll just have to listen. We're going to take a road trip to the largest town in New England area-wise. And again, I'm not going to spoil it because it's no place you probably could think of. Largest town by area. We're going to go way back in the day, 20 years ago, to the release of Nirvana's final song, You Know You're Right. There's going to be a brand new top 5 as we get spooky again as I talk about my favorite 1980s horror movies. And, of course, there'll be a brand new This Week in History and Time Capsule coming up next week on episode 88 of the In My Footsteps podcast. I've said it a whole bunch in the last few weeks, and I'll continue to say it. This is my favorite time of year. All those holidays I talked about, plus my birthday. But even with all of that, it's important to focus on your mental health. This is my favorite time of year, and I'm really leaning heavy into all the stuff I enjoy. The sunsets, photography in general, road trips, the weather still being nice, warm in the day and cool at night, fitness, feeling good physically and mentally. It all goes hand in hand. So make sure you do the same thing. Lean into what makes you happy. Always try to make the next day better than the one before, even if it's by 1/1,000,000%. Whether it's one big step or a million tiny steps, as long as you're moving forward, that dream, that goal, whatever it is, it's still in sight. I thank you once again for tuning into episode 87 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Whatever you do, have a great week, a great weekend. And this has been the In My Footsteps podcast. I have been Christopher Setterland, and I will talk to you all again soon.